And what's up, everybody, and welcome back to Coast Gridiron. For this episode, I'd like to introduce my very special guest, insider at TSN for everything football. That's CFL, NFL, NCAA, you name it, Mr. Dave Naylor. Dave Naylor, how are you doing this morning?
Very well. Thanks for having me on.
I know you're really busy, Dave, so I appreciate you joining me and giving my viewers some just, like I said, everything CFL, everything NFL, NCAA. So I really appreciate you joining me this morning.
That's what I do, man. Talk football. So,
So when I was researching just a little bit for this interview, I kind of came across a very cool story, and I just had to ask, going down memory lane for you a little bit. Um, Speaking about maybe a story in 1995, if you could maybe share a little bit about your experience at a Rough Riders 4-day mini camp or training camp. Sorry, could you just maybe explain that story a little bit for my viewers?
yeah, I was working in Saskatchewan for CBC, primarily in radio, but a little bit in television in the mid 90s. And, I had read as a kid, I had read Paper Lion, which was the George Plimpton book about, how he went to training camp with the Detroit Lions. And there have been people that have tried similar things over the years, I think. And I was in 1995, in the spring of 1995, I was 27 years old. So I thought, well, I'm kind of the right age to do this, right? I'm not trying to do this when I'm 40, and I'm not trying to do this when I'm 21 or whatever. And so I went to Ray Yock, who was, I pitched the idea at CBC Radio, and they were interested in it. I went to Ray Yock, who was the head coach of the Rough Riders at that time, and I said, what do you think? And he said, okay, two things. One, you got to do everything. You can't drop in and drop out. If you're with us, you're with us. All the meetings, all the practices, all the drills, all that. And the other thing he said is you better be in shape. And so that was, I kind of walked out of there and thought, okay, this doesn't sound that hard. And I remember walking in a couple of things that were weird that I didn't realize you have to do. I had to get a physical. I had to be, before I could be on the field. I had to sign a contract because once you're on the field, you have to be insured by the CFL Players Association. So I actually signed a CFL contract that, 4 days later I was released from. But I remember walking in for my medical at some doctor's clinic in Regina, right? And walking through the waiting room and looking at the guys that were there and going, oh my God, like, what am I doing here? Right. Like these guys were anyway. So when I showed up, I never tried to fool anybody. The first day at training camp, they thought I was a punter. Everybody thought I was a punter. And I wasn't trying to fool anybody. And when I talked to guys, I said, hey, you guys are here for jobs. I'm here for a story. I'm going to go last in every drill. And the minute I'm in your way, let me know, right? Because I don't want to get in anybody's way to earn a job. Anyway, I lasted 4 days. It was a neat experience. I mean, showing up to my locker every day and seeing my laundry done, and then guys come up and help me tape up, and the meetings and watching film every night after practice because they tape everything, which got lots of hilarity when I was on one-on-one coverage on the corner. Those reps got a lot of turned into comedy at night, and I also learned a lot about guys coming to the CFL just culturally, right? I mean, I was in a group of defensive backs. I think four of them had been in NFL camps the year before, and they all thought they're coming to play in Canada, and then they realized that, hold on, only one of us gets out of rookie camp, maybe two gets out of rookie camp, and there's four of us, right? So you get a sense of kind of how much a lot of the players don't know about where they are and what the league that they're playing in, and you get and you get a sense of kind of how competitive is it. It was really more learning about the player experience than it was even learning X's and O's for me. I got released 4 days later. I got to do, I don't think I ever hit anybody, but I got to run an interception drill where, I got to take one back where they purposely floated one out and I was the safety who had to catch it, and everybody lined up and blocked for me, and I got to run, kind of, and although it's not full blocking in that. Anyway, I'm glad I did it. And yeah, it's just funny because there was somebody about a year ago, a producer at CBC who was retiring, was cleaning out her desk and found that photo
Photo, yeah.
and somehow dropped it in the mail to me. And this is like a year ago. And so when I found it in the mail, I popped it up on Twitter and said, wow, like, look at this. And then 3 Down Nation wrote a story about it. And now it's on my Wikipedia page. So it's like, it's kind of come back to life because that CBC producer was cleaning out her desk about a year ago.
Super cool story. I mean, personally, I've never heard another story like that. So just when I was coming across doing a few things, getting ready for this, I was like, I have to
Yeah.
ask about this story and kind of get a little bit of the behind the scenes. And
Yeah.
this
28
sucks.
years ago, man. 28 years ago.
I can imagine that was like for someone that covers football, that's kind of cool. It gave you an aspect of kind of what these guys go through from a very early start, and you kind of understood the like the coach said, you're going to do everything. You're not going to come in and out,
Yep.
and you're going to be a part of the team. So I'd imagine that kind of gave you a nice perspective of you never played football until that moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny. Most of the guys were great, and I say like they were awesome. There was a guy named Percy Snow who had won the Butkus Award at Michigan State as the outstanding linebacker in college football. He was a first round pick, I believe, of the Kansas City Chiefs, the Chicago Bears, one of the other. He was a first round pick, and he was in camp with us that year.
Oh God.
And he was the one guy who I didn't know if he really liked the whole idea, right? Like he would look at me and he would say, "What are you looking at, reporter?" Like he would put reporter at the end of every sentence,
Oh
right? Like he
God.
didn't like reporter being there, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if he was just busting on me or what. But that's one other thing I remember. The other thing about it was my position coach with the defensive backs with Saskatchewan that year was Richie Hall in his first year of coaching,
Cool.
and he's the defensive coordinator of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers now, and has had a long and really esteemed career in coaching in the CFL. But I was one of his very first pupils when he first started coaching in 1995.
That's so cool, Dave. I just like I said, I had to ask and get a little quick behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes of what that story
Sure.
was. So moving forward, obviously we got some news, I believe yesterday, I guess it was officially announced that the Montreal Alouettes have a new owner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Pierre Carl Palado, if I'm saying that correct.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this will be overall a good thing for the CFL and for Montreal? I think as a Lions fan, I kind of seen that local ownership kind of brought back some life into the team. I believe this is Montreal's first local owner in a while. I believe 1987 or something like that. So do you just think this is an overall good move for the Montreal Alouettes and the CFL?
Yeah, I do, and I think you've got a few things in Pierre Carl Pelado. One, enormous wealth, right? So there's not going to be an issue. Not that there has been with previous owners, but like the resources to be able to put into the team if he wants are there, like and then some. He's a billionaire. Uh, then you talk about he's the president and CEO. It's a publicly traded company. He doesn't own it, but he is the president and CEO of Quebecor, a gigantic media company that has significant reach. I don't know anything about his strategy for how he's going to use his media resources to promote awareness of the Alouettes, but that would seem like a not very difficult thing to be able to do when you're in a position like him. And I think if you look at his business history and I guess even his political history, he's been an aggressive guy. And that's kind of just the one thing I would say. I don't think he's going to take over the Alouettes and in 5 years, he will have been the silent owner that we've never heard from and that has never come up with any ideas or tried to innovate or do creative things. I would expect quite the opposite. I would think he's going to have a strong presence. I would not be surprised if there's a stadium project here somewhere along the way in his vision. And I think he's going to be one of 9 at the CFL Board of Governors. And I just think because he seems to be a relatively aggressive businessman, the local presence. I mentioned the media reach, the wealth, all those things. Tick a lot of boxes. Now, does it mean he'll be a great owner? No, it doesn't, because sometimes guys come in and they've been wildly successful in other areas of business. And they come into sports and they get very emotional, and they don't let their emotions run their business decisions in their other businesses, but they get into football and they do. So we'll see. But I think overall, I think Randy Ambrosie, the commissioner, was feeling very well like it's going to be a long time before he has to attend another news conference in Montreal about ownership. And I was at the last one 3 years ago. I was in the room for that one, and I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like a long-term solution. This feels like a bridge. And I mean, right down to the point that one of the 2 gentlemen they sold the team to was 90. So
And
I think.
And sorry, who was that again? I believe he never even got to end up seeing
He did no, no.
because of the
Sid Siegel
COVID.
was his name. He owned the team through the season that didn't happen, and then passed away before the partial season that did. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and then left, I believe, the 25% to Mr. Gary Stern, if I'm not
correct.
mistaken.
Yeah, and it was
Um,
taken. The league reacquired the team, within the last couple of months, and I think it was a cleaner sale process with the league negotiating exclusively without the other owners involved. Yeah.
from not knowing much about business and what it takes to own a CFL team, it seems like this guy kind of means business, if you will. He seems very like he wants to mean this and like you said, stay for more than say 2, 3, 4 years and kind of get out of there. I'm curious now. Moving on. How do you see? I was watching the 3 down interview with Mr. Randy Ambrosi at the winter meetings
Mm-hmm.
there, and he
Mm-hmm.
talked about the anchored TV media deal with the U.S. and kind of talked about it kind of coming to hopefully announcing something soon. What are you kind of hearing on that and kind of what that'll mean to the CFL down south? I mean, the biggest football market in the world is the US. Everybody knows that. Something that I was kind of curious, or something that's kind of a little bit of a narrative, is that these games kind of just pop up. They're not like pre shown on ESPN or anything like that, given that a lot of these guys come from US colleges, come from the US just in general, and kind of outside, I feel like maybe their family being known that they're playing on a given day. How do you think that this deal can maybe improve and showcase the CFL a little bit more down there?
Well, the CFL has been on American TV forever, right? Like, and it's been different places. It's been on Sports Channel USA. It's been on the NFL Network. It's been on ESPN. It's been like you name it, it's been there. And every time they've done it, it's always been like, well, it's good for exposure. It's good for our players to see the league. Helps for recruiting. So they've seen it there when they play in the league. Their friends and families can watch, and we hope someday to monetize it. Right. That last part has been the trick. And I believe that the league has been able to monetize its U.S. broadcast rights this time. And I believe it's to more than one carrier. And the biggest clue to me that this was going to be something, and I don't know what we call significant, right? Like I don't know. Honestly, it's not my area of expertise, but let's just say somebody paid $5 million US for a year of CFL broadcast rights. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you dropped $500,000 US onto every CFL team's budget and just said, here, you don't do anything else extra. You're not, you just run your business and here's $500,000 US. Like that would be better than what we've been getting in the past, right? Which has been nothing. And I honestly don't know. Maybe $5 million US is high. Maybe it's low. I don't know. Not my area of expertise, but I do believe they've been able to monetize this. And the first clue to this being significant was when the schedule came out. You may have noticed Sunday nights at 7 p.m. from the start of the season till Labor Day, all except for, I think, 2 weeks, there's a CFL game. Now, normally, this league doesn't play on Sundays,
Right.
like fall or summer. It's not a Sunday league. It's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday league in the summer, and it's a Friday, Saturday league in the fall. Well, now it's a Sunday league in the summer. And no matter where they play, whether they're playing in BC or Winnipeg or Toronto on those Sunday nights, the games are always 7 p.m. Eastern. Okay. So that looks to me like it's set up for US television.
Yeah.
And to get around that problem you alluded to, which is that, the games kind of just pop out of nowhere, right? And you think about the way Americans watch football. Friday night is high school, Saturday's college, Sunday's the NFL, and the NFL is now taking Mondays and Thursdays as well. But my point is they know when the games are. In the CFL, I mean, I'm old enough to go back to the expansion era. That was a real issue when the CFL had U.S. teams. Was we're playing on Thursday, we're playing on Saturday. Like it was all over the place, right? And that for Americans was kind of like, huh? So I think what they're trying to do is get a very regimented schedule for U.S. TV. And Sunday night is a logical one because NBC has turned it into the number one viewing night in America for television in the fall. You've seen even the XFL is using Sunday nights now. So if Sunday nights is available for that 3 months, let's put football on American TV and let's take that slot. And I think that's that's significant. And look, I don't know what the CFL's chances are on American TV versus these other leagues, but in about 10 days, something called March Madness is going to start, right? And then the NBA playoffs are going to start and the NHL playoffs start. When I look at the sports calendar, I would much rather, if I was trying to put a professional football league on American television, I would much rather go up against baseball in June, July, and August than go up against, basketball, baseball, hockey, the NFL draft, all this stuff that happens through the spring. I think the spring's much more crowded than the summer. And if you don't like baseball, which a lot of people these days, can take it or leave it, a lot of people love it, but it's not exactly winning the demographic war. There's a lot of people that there's not anything really else to turn on. So I think their U.S. television strategy makes some sense. I've always felt like there should have been a way to monetize it. And, you've got, most of your players are Americans. So not most of your stars are Americans. Half your players are American. And most of your stars are Americans. They all have roots in the U.S. They all played college football in the U.S. somewhere. I think I don't see a lot of downside in this one.
Yeah, I'm interested to see. You definitely enlightened me on a few points that I think are really something to think, give me something to think about. I think about kind of these college communities. I mean, you got these Geno Lewis's that go to Oklahoma, or Zach Collaros that's Cincinnati. Like, these guys from their college towns, they can kind of carry their fandom into the CFL, where you can kind of still watch them and still get to follow their career. So I'm interested to see how it does when it does get announced. That's something interesting about the schedule that you bring up, and I think that's a very good point. So I appreciate that. Moving forward, there was a little bit of talk about pop-up stadium at St. Mary's University, and kind of just alluding more to CFL expansion and kind of the positive that could bring to the CFL. Having 10 teams in the league, I believe that would bring down the schedule by a few weeks. I believe it's 21-week schedule now. It could be around 19-week schedule if we had another team. Just what do you think expansion could mean to the CFL, and just what are you hearing overall?
Well, I think the league is working with some business consultants that are sort of advising it on a strategy. And one of the things the consultants have told them is you need to get to 10 teams. And I think there's multiple reasons for it. One, it creates the sense of growth and progress. You can complete the national map by putting a team in Atlantic Canada. But I think those are secondary. I think the biggest one is basically you're going to go from 4 games a week to 5. Like that in its own, you're going to produce 25% more content by adding one team. Like you're only adding 10% of the teams, right? You're going to have 10 teams, and this team will constitute 10% of the league, but you'll actually generate 25% more games and content by adding per week. And then what you can do, as you alluded to, is you can get rid of the 3 bye weeks, probably be 1. So you probably change the schedule from 21 weeks to maybe 20, to 19, play 18 games in 19 weeks. You get rid of teams playing on short weeks. You get rid of teams playing on long weeks. There's still going to be some variance, but it won't be as extreme as it is right now. You get rid of weeks where there's only 2 games or only 3 games, as we see with bye weeks, and you can start the season at the same amount of time and play the Grey Cup early, which is something that people want to do. I think there's a real desire to play the Grey Cup earlier. I'm not sure there's a great desire to move the season up, into early May or something like that. So I think it does a lot of things for you. And I think what they've realized is that the business of stadium financing in Canada, outdoor stadium financing, is extremely, extremely difficult because you can only use these facilities half the year. There aren't that many events that require 25,000 seats. There's enormous cost. There's land. There's all of that. And a lot of times those kind of decisions get made on emotion. Why Saskatchewan has the nicest stadium in the league? Because the emotion related to that team is very powerful, and people want to, it's something people want to invest in, from politicians to business leaders to ordinary fans. Toronto, the emotion not so high, right? Which is why they are second tenants in a facility that is mostly about soccer. So I think one of the things that they're looking at is saying, well, look, if we have to build a $200 million stadium before we can get in there, that's a big outlay. That's a big risk, right? For a league where you don't know if it's going to work. You have governments that got other priorities. There has been a lack of sort of local business people who've stood up and championed this. It's always been more people from the outside. So they look at it and say, well, what if we put up a pop-up stadium? One of these ones that's going to last 5 to 10 years. We get the team, and then once the team is established and people rally around it, and you've got the emotion kind of attached to it, then we start talking about a stadium. And I made this analogy in a radio interview last fall when this idea first came up, and a few people have brought it back to me and said, yeah, you're right. And I think it is. If you look at the Toronto Blue Jays in 1976, when they were awarded an expansion team, they did not have a Major League Baseball facility in Toronto. They played an exhibition stadium, which was a converted football stadium, which is the most ridiculous baseball configuration like I've ever seen, right? Well, maybe when the Dodgers played at the LA Coliseum, that was worse. But you know what I'm saying? It didn't fit. But if you'd waited for Skydome to get built before you got a Major League Baseball team in Toronto, there would be no Major League Baseball team in Toronto. Like it had to be team first, stadium second. Now, in a lot of markets, it's not like that. In the US, where, as much as they say they are, more conservative and more private driven than we are in Canada, when it comes to business and government, not so when it comes to stadiums. In the US, they are way more socialist when it comes to building stadiums than we are. And so, you see a lot of cities and states and counties will bend over backwards to build stadiums for their teams, or to attract teams, just on the speculation of being able to attract teams. That doesn't happen in Canada, particularly with outdoor stadiums. So I think it's an alternative strategy. I don't think it's a bad strategy. And I think it's also a strategy aimed at making this happen sooner than later. I think there's a bit of fatigue creeping into the Halifax conversation. Even me as a journalist, right? When something happens out there, I'm kind of like, oh boy. I think my readers, my viewers are getting a little, wake me when it's up on this story, right? And I'm not saying that we ignore it, but I would say there have been a number of false starts in the market, and COVID has something to do with it. And that there are certain stories that maybe we start to cover a little bit differently, because it's more like, look, tell me when this is done. I don't really need to know every step of the process here or whatever. And we're not quite at that point on this story, but I would say that there's a bit of that creeping into this. And I think the league knows that this probably can't be something that they can pump for 5 more years and have the team roll out in 2028. I think it's got to be something that's going to have to happen a little sooner. And the opportunity, the pop-up stadium does give you an opportunity to do this, in a much quicker way than, just think of what goes into building a stadium, right? You've got to finance it. You've got to get the land. You've got to get the architects. It's a big, I remember talking to the guy in Ottawa, and I'm trying to remember what the number was. Like, I don't want to get it wrong, but the question was, how long did it take from the first time those owners got together, over coffee or beer and said, what if we redeveloped Lansdowne and brought the CFL back, till kickoff? And it was a while. Like, it was, I'm going to say they started in 2014. I bet it was about 2007 to 8, something like that. It's a while. Like, so that, I don't know that the CFL wants to wait that long to get into the market, or not even so much get into the market, get that 10th team. So that's how I look at expansion.
Yeah, I think that would just be too long for sure. As someone that experienced Empire Stadium, the pop-up version, it obviously wasn't around for 5 or 10 years, but yeah. I think that was a good experience. It was, you were nice and close to the football. You got a good experience of watching football, and I think something like that would be kind of good to just let's get this team in. Let's get the positive this team's gonna bring, and just kind of hopefully build it from there. So I'm just
and I think partnering with the university is always a good idea, because you can, there's goodwill there. The university can use the facility. Obviously, saves you on real estate. You look at it right now. We already have 2 stadiums that are sitting on university lands, right? Montreal, Calgary. Actually 3, Winnipeg and Calgary. Yeah. Winnipeg is the University of Manitoba as well. And of course, that one's newly built, right? They built it on university land. Yeah, brand new.
Yeah, so interested to see where that happens, and I hope it happens soon, because I just think the positive that it'll bring the CFL will just be tremendous. So interested to see when this kind of it gets some real momentum going, and not just kind of let's see when it happens. So you were at the NFL Combine last week and got a look at a lot of the top prospects that are going to be entering the NFL draft. There was a nice Canadian presence. We'll start there. Can you just maybe give our viewers just a little bit of what you saw from the 5 Canadians that attended it? Um, what maybe their potential will be in the draft, where you see them maybe fitting, and just an overall outlook of what you saw from the 5 Canadians that were at the NFL Combine.
Yeah, I believe 5 Canadians at the NFL Combine is an all-time high. 4 of them were in the Senior Bowl, which is another marquee event in the offseason for top prospects down in Mobile, Alabama. And there've never been 5 drafted in one draft. So if all 5 get taken, it would be a 1-year high, and it would also be a 3-year high. We've had 7 in the last 2 years, so 12 over 3 years would also be a high. So you're certainly seeing more and more young football players in Canada growing up aiming at the National Football League and willing to do the things necessary to put themselves, on that stage. And I mean, the headliners around this one, and it's funny because as a Canadian, and this has happened to me a lot, that when I cover NFL draft events, whether it's the combine or usually the Senior Bowl or something like that, the Canadian story is often one that really grabs everybody. Like the number one, I mean, I remember being at the Senior Bowl. Danny Watkins was like the number one story of the draft. Bang. He was the Canadian. You know what I mean? It was like when Nathan Shepard came out, USA Today wrote like 3,000 words on his story, the Canadian. You know what I mean? And it's kind of felt like that with Sydney and Chase Brown. It's a great Canadian story, but it transcends the fact that they're Canadian down there. Everybody was talking about them, just because it's such a cool story. And they're both so good. I mean, their time. I mean, Sydney ran. They both tested fantastically down there, both of them, to the point that they didn't do their pro day on Friday, March 10th in Illinois because they were so happy with the times that they laid down in Indianapolis. They're impressive kids. They speak well. Sydney was a captain on defense. He gets described in terms you don't hear Canadian players described as very often, and that is he's a very instinctual player, like a guy who has qualities that you can't measure. You can kind of see them on film, but only he can really describe it to you. Comparisons made to players like Troy Polamalu or Tyrann Mathieu that are instinctual safeties. And then you have Chase, who led the nation in rushing for most of last season. Is durable, can catch the ball. Can run outside, can run between the tackles, can break tackles. He's and he ran a 4.43, right? So those are really impressive kids, and they have a great backstory. We grew up in London, Ontario, and really just found a way to make their dreams come true. And it's a remarkable story. I think Sidney Brown will be the second Canadian taken. Chase will be later because he's a running back, and NFL teams kind of devalue running backs in this era. But the top player taken is going to be Matthew Bergeron, I think, out of Syracuse, the left tackle. And he could creep into the first round. I mean, you look at Matthew Bergeron, who had one scholarship offer, Syracuse, because he showed up at camp, no one knew who he was. They offered him a spot, shot basically on the spot, or 2 days later, and he accepted. I mean, with his position and his draft position and his potential, I mean, you're talking about a player that could not easily. You're talking about a player that could make $150 million like in his first 8 years in the NFL or something like that. Like it's an astounding amount of money, particularly because of his position. Then you look at Tavius Robinson, who again tested very well, defensive lineman out of University of Mississippi. He's born and raised in Guelph, was playing at Guelph until COVID hit, got himself down to Ole Miss. 3 seasons in the SEC later, he's at the Combine. And Sidi Sow, who is an offensive lineman out of Quebec. I think there were only 4 players out of the Mid-American Conference that were invited to the Combine. He was one of them. And I'll be honest, like 10 years ago, we would have been doing a story at the Combine on the 6th round pick offensive lineman projected. He would have been our story. And, now you've got players that, and not to be disrespectful to offensive linemen, but there was a time when you covered
skill position
NFL.
players.
Yeah, you were talking about offensive linemen, long snappers, kickers, and punters. That was basically Canada's NFL contribution. But now you really, and this reflected in this draft class and the last few draft classes, that you've got positions all over the field, both sides of the ball. It's really amazing. And I think that, like we saw in basketball, right, where it went from being an outlier to a regular thing. I mean, I find NBA players now that I don't even know they're Canadian until I'm looking them up. I'm like, oh, that guy's from Toronto, or that guy's from Montreal. I'm not a huge NBA guy, but pay attention. So you're getting to those kind of numbers, and I think we're getting there in the National Football League right now as well.
It's starting to become normal, which is nice to see. I mean, you got guys that are playing receiver like Josh Palmer, Chase Claypool. I mean, the guys in the secondary. I mean, I'm a Bills fan, and I have to. I love Javon Holland. Forgive me. Um, but just seeing these guys that are playing skill position, Benjamin St. Juste playing corner, and these guys are starting in the league. So it's super cool to see. And even like you said, right? We got running back, we got a safety, we got a couple linemen, D linemen. So just cool to see the variance of the position starting to really, it's like I said, become normal now in Canada that these guys
Yeah.
can see a way to the NFL.
And I think that raises the whole boat. Like, I mean, one of the real challenges for the CFL is that 40 years ago, all the best Canadian football players were playing in the CFL because they could make more money starting as Canadians in the CFL than they could, if you were a backup in the NFL. That's obviously not the case these days. So, in some ways, it's a challenge for the CFL because so many Canadian players are going to prioritize getting to the National Football League over playing in the CFL, and they're going to play it out as long as they can to get that opportunity. And in some ways, they're developing beyond the league if they're successful. I mean, Sidney and Chase Brown are the two top-rated prospects for the CFL draft, but they're not going to be selected anywhere near the top of the CFL draft. That's what I'm getting at. But I think that raises the whole boat. Like, I think when you've got a half dozen players every year out of Canada that are going to sign in the National Football League, either through the draft or through undrafted free agency, that's going to bring up the next tier, the middle tier, the level of football that's coming out of Canada, I think gets brought up by the top end because people see what those guys can do. So shoot where you can. And if you don't make it, guess where you end up? Canadian Football League. So I think it's good for player development in Canada for the CFL, these guys making it to the NFL, even though in one instance it doesn't look that way. I think the overall effect though is positive.
Yes, I agree. As a Bills fan, personally, I know you covered the Bills a little bit. They're going to be having a big need at safety, so my fingers are crossed. I'm hoping, hopefully, Sydney's available maybe at 59 or something like that, because it doesn't look like Jordan's coming back. I think Sydney's able to fill that role very well, be able to play kind of that high safety, be able to play down in the box. He obviously had 6 interceptions last year. Kind of every year of late, I've kind of hoped that the Bills drafted the Canadian. It hasn't happened yet. We have Eli Anku, but he was an undrafted player. So this year, I'm kind of tying my string to Sidney Brown and kind of hoping that the Bills pick him this year. It would be awesome.
It's funny, I talked to Eli Anku during the year. He went to St. Peter's High School in the east end of Ottawa, which I used to live in a house that basically backed onto that schoolyard, or not quite, but when I drove around the corner, St. Peter's was right there. And I said, I probably drove by you when you were in high school, like a whole bunch of times, and you were there playing. Now he's with the Bills. And to your point about Sidney Brown, and I said to the people in Indianapolis, I said, man, you look at the Bills, they're probably going to lose Devin Singletary. They're going to use Jordan Poyer. Oh, okay, take Sidney Brown in the second round, take Chase Brown in the fourth or fifth. I mean, honestly, the earlier Sidney goes, probably the greater chance is somebody might try and unite them. Now, I don't know if they would, right? But the idea is if you put them together, do you get more than the sum of the two, right? I don't know. But I'm just saying that if they were both going to be second round picks, it's pretty hard to get them both. But if Sidney's going to be a second and Chase is going to be a fourth or fifth, then that becomes a little more realistic. And I thought, well, maybe the Bills could slot Sidney Brown in at safety and Chase Brown to replace Devin Singletary, and they'd be playing an hour from their mom. Like that. That would be all right too.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. I mean, like you said, Chase led the country in rushing yards for a lot of the year. We have a need at both positions. So personally, as a Canadian, as a Bills fan, I would love to see the Brown brothers reunited on the Bills. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in April. I'm curious. You were down there. You got to see the four kind of big guns in the draft. Obviously, we have Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Will Levis, Anthony Richardson blowing up the combine. We had the big news yesterday. If kind of what are you hearing? And if you're the Carolina Panthers, when you're turning in the card, kind of who would you choose? And maybe just what are you hearing for this first overall pick that kind of they paid a lot to go up to get him?
You know what? I tell you, I learned something about the way NFL teams can disguise what they want, what they're doing last year. And granted, this was not with a high pick; it was a more back of the draft pick. And it was with Jesse Luketa, who came out of Penn State and played this year with the Arizona Cardinals when he was drafted. And he had gone to the Senior Bowl, he had gone to the Combine, he had been flown in for visits, with teams and all those kind of gone through the whole process. And at the end of his draft day, I said to him, "Did you ever talk to Arizona?" He said, "No, not once." Like, so it's like, trying to figure out where these guys are going based on these. Sometimes that's not the game. And look, I assume they're going to take a quarterback. I've seen a report out there that they're going to take the corner from Illinois. His name's escaping me right
I
now.
forget his name too. What a secondary though.
Oh,
Witherspoon.
I know. Yeah, and then the guy who skipped the combine and he skipped the pro day and he's going to do his own private workout. I would think it's given the state of that franchise at quarterback and the importance of that position and the players that are available this year, I would find it hard to believe they're not going to take a quarterback. And I think that obviously Bryce Young was the one who didn't throw. He's going to throw at Alabama's pro day. What struck me about that class of those four is they all have kind of very different issues and questions around, right? You can frame each of them and say, these are the issues with this player, and then move on to the next one and the next one and the next one. They're different. And I'll just try to do it really quickly, right? Bryce Young does everything beautifully, except he's 5'10" and a quarter and like 208. That's a very small body to play quarterback in the National Football League. Not even just his height, but his whole weight, his physical makeup, right? And so
You're kind of seeing that with Tua a little bit.
sure. That's a yeah. I mean, you need to be able to stand up to, and I always, and this is just me, but I always look when you look at a quarterback from Alabama, you have to look at things like how often was he getting hit right behind that offensive line and those receivers that could get open and things like that. Where it's not going to be like that in the NFL. Then you look at Will Levis, right, who comes in with by his own description, the cannon, big arm guy. Had to transfer around a little bit. Didn't get the respect. First he was at Penn State, then he ends up transferring to Western Kentucky. People see Josh Allen in him, right? This is often you see a lot where guys will see somebody who's just come through the draft a few years ago, and is he certainly maybe more refined than Josh Allen was when he came out of Wyoming. Then you look at Anthony Richardson, physical freak. I mean, I was in his scrum when he reminded everybody he's 20. 20? I mean, I look at the eyeballs like crashing into each other going, my God, like he's 20. So the raw potential there, the physical freakness, and the idea that, I mean, like if you draft him and he backs up for 3 years, he's still going to become your starting quarterback at 23. I don't know when he turns 21 this spring, but my point is he doesn't have to be your week one starter. He doesn't have to be your year one or year two starter. You got time with that. You can develop him. And then the other one, and I found this one interesting, CJ Stroud. We've come through years where African-American quarterbacks are asked about, can they throw from the pocket and not just run? Like we've seen those questions, and they're not always aimed at African-American quarterbacks, but a lot of times they are. And that can create kind of an uncomfortable dynamic where people feel like they're pigeonholing the player. And there's been lots written and discussed about this over the years. But I thought it was interesting when I was in CJ Stroud's scrum. The issue for him, people were asking about was, can he run? Will he accept that the target isn't there and he needs to tuck it and run and get outside the tackles and make yards with his feet? And I think that just showed that the stereotype of African American quarterbacks that has been out there is being challenged by actually looking at what the player does. And I just thought that was interesting that you saw that here's a guy who is not showing up to the combine having to answer questions about his ability to throw the football. He's showing up to the combine answering questions about his ability to not throw the football and run with it. So, different questions that surrounded all of the players there. And, there's not I'm just trying to think of, an Andrew Luck or a Trevor Lawrence or a player who people would look at and say, or, this is a player who is the finely tuned finished product coming out of college. He's your week one starter. I mean, well, some of those guys would be week one starters, I think, but they're not as, I would say there's still more questions about them than there have been some other guys that have come out in recent years.
I'm very curious to see what happens. It's kind of maybe a hard thing to answer now because of it'll be more determined by the outcome of the two franchises. But in your opinion, who do you think maybe kind of won that trade? If you're Chicago, sticking with Justin Fields and kind of being able to recoup some picks and hopefully loading up around him with, as well as getting DJ Moore, you have a kind of legit number one receiver. You can go get the premier receiver in this draft if you want at 9 or what have you, an offensive lineman. And just your opinion, who do you think maybe has the upper hand as of now in this trade?
Well, I think this is a trade. There's a classic example of a trade that can be both, right? Like I love the idea that a team drops 8 spots in the draft and is able to load up so much with assets. And generally, those types of trades in sports work out for the teams that get the haul, right? Because you're not banking on one ticket. You've now got multiple tickets. And I mean, we know they weren't going to take a quarterback at number 1, right? And it was actually funny. CJ Stroud said right out, I don't want to go to Chicago. Like that's Justin's team. We don't see our players say that very often. But if you look at the downgrade in the player that they're going to get, let's forget quarterbacks for a second. The difference between the player at 1 that they could take if they wanted anybody and the player at 9 that they're going to get is not near as great as the haul of assets that they got for moving down 8 spots. So it's really hard to look at the Bears unless they completely miss on all these picks and say that wasn't a great move for them, because there's just not the difference is not great enough. You're not giving up enough in those 8 spots to compare to what you're getting in that haul. And then you look at, from Carolina's perspective, if they take Anthony Richardson and he turns into Lamar Jackson, or they take Will Levis and he turns into Josh Allen, it'd be pretty hard to say they didn't win that trade either, right? So I think because the two teams are looking for such different things, right? One is looking to land the player that they can build their franchise around, and one is looking to build depth and talent around the franchise player. The timing works out where both sides of the deal can really, you can, and I know it may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think in a deal like that, it's more possible than in deals where you're kind of looking at asset for asset in the current time and not trading futures for that. I think it's way more likely you get a trade that actually there's no loser in.
Yeah, I agree totally with that. I mean, Carolina kind of gets a chance to reset, like you said, reset your franchise, get your franchise guy. Maybe it's Anthony Richardson and he's not able to play these first few years, but when he is ready, you're able to kind of, especially in the NFC where it's, I feel like, a little bit more open now with these quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers potentially leaving. There's not really, I feel like, an alpha as of yet in the NFC, and some of these guys maybe in a few years can kind of take the reins and be that premier quarterback in the NFC. So I'm interested to see what happens from this quarterback class. It's super interesting because I feel like there's not, like you said, that Andrew Luck type that's guaranteed to be drafted number 1 by the Panthers. It could be any number of the 4 of them. So interested to see what happens, and it makes for a little bit of drama. Of course, the NFL gonna keep NFLing and getting all those views on draft night, I would imagine, to see who's ended up being the number 1 overall pick this year. So just couple quick Bills questions, because I know you were on the team last year and such. So there's a little bit of a rumor going on online about Bijan Robinson. I saw that you tweeted about it. I'm not sure. I just think as a Bills fan, personally, I would rather maybe a later round back. I think we've invested. I know obviously we're losing Devin Singletary. We lost Zach Moss last year in the trade of Nyheim Hines. We've invested 2 of those 3rd round picks. James Cook last year. I don't think James Cook's able to be that lead back by himself. So I would like to address the position, but just in your opinion, would it be smart for the Bills to take Bijan? Is this maybe a potential smokescreen, like you alluded to, that teams will try to throw people off of who they're going to be looking at? What in your opinion, what do you think?
Well, it's funny because it reminds me a little bit that during the season, the Saquon Barkley story came out, right? Like, would the Bills trade for Saquon Barkley? Because when you look at Buffalo, they had, a very dynamic offense starting with their quarterback. They have an absolutely elite number 1 receiver, a tight end who's kind of developing towards being elite, they believe, if you look at the contract they paid him, and some number 2 and 3 receivers that maybe left them a little bit lacking over the course of the entire season, and running backs that do the job but don't really frighten anyone, right? So I think when you looked at ways in Buffalo's offense and you said, okay, the one thing they really haven't had, like while Josh Allen's been there, is a back you need to prepare for, right? A guy who teams fear. Devin Singletary is a very productive back. James Cook probably was the most improved player on the Bills in the second half of the season, but his style again doesn't terrorize teams as much, right? He's a smaller guy, bounces it outside into space, can catch the ball, but he's not. No one's ever going to mistake him for Derrick Henry or Saquon Barkley. And I think when you get to running backs, and this is kind of related to what we had in the Chase Brown conversation, one of the reasons it's very tough for teams to spend high picks on them is so many of them have such similar skill sets. And then every once in a while, you have the guy who stands out, right? And they don't come along every year, even, right? I'd say the last few have probably been Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, and now Bijan Robinson. And so I find it intriguing, the idea that the Bills could, add a guy who could be a dynamic player out of the backfield, just because we haven't seen that offense. We haven't seen that in their offense. What would a dynamic Josh Allen be with a dynamic running back who can catch the ball as well, right? Which is something you certainly want to do if you've got Josh Allen as your quarterback. The Bills don't throw the balls to the running backs. It's ridiculous. I say ridiculous. It's puzzling the way they don't do it.
They don't call screens.
It's one of those weird two things. The Bills, for all how prolific their offense is, their yards after catch numbers are horrible, and they don't throw to the. And those are two kind of puzzling things. So I actually, I gave that tweet a little. I think I put a couple exclamation marks because I that intrigues me to see what their offense would look like, with a player like that. But I think the only reason we're even having the conversation is that they understand it would have to be a guy who's a real game changer.
And Brandon Beane said that before. He said that if it was that Christian McCaffrey type, Alvin Kamara type, that he would just in my opinion, I feel like it's a little bit hot. Just the value, I like if it was a game changer, obviously perspective is a little bit different. But just I feel like we're gonna have some holes. There's probably gonna be a middle linebacker, a safety spot to fill. I think protecting Josh Allen, receiver 2, and then just the value. I feel like you can find, not that I don't want to compare Chase Brown to Bijan Robinson, but you can get these guys. And Isaiah Pacheco for the Chiefs last year was a 7th round pick and gave them some meaningful snaps and big snaps in the Super Bowl. So I just feel like if we can kind of fill those holes that maybe are a little bit maybe bigger, because I feel like James Cook will take a little bit of a bigger role. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to see if you traded for Nyheim Hines, is he just your kick returner, punt returner, or is he maybe you want to give him a little bit of that Isaiah McKenzie kind of jet sweep type role? I'm super curious to kind of just see what happens. And like I said, I trust in Brandon Beane, so whatever he does, I will get behind. But I'm kind of leaning towards, I hope it's not a running back, but I mean, Bijan Robinson's his highlight video is very impressive. So I think I could probably get over it very quickly, and I'm super interested to see what happens. Just 2 more questions.
You're right. Brandon Beane did confirm last year, right after the trade deadline, that he had made calls on Kamara and Christian McCaffrey. Yeah.
Yeah. So he is interested, and Josh is getting older. It is maybe a concern. Maybe like, hey, you get a lead back and you take 100 hits off Josh, and he's maybe not that he's been injured or anything like that, and is something that kind of bugs me, that as a narrative, is the 2 injuries that he's had has been in the pocket, not running. He's been in the pocket both times he's gotten hurt. He got hit on the elbow last year, and then Jacksonville, kind of same type of injury. Personally, obviously my heart kind of stops a little bit when he gets outside the pocket, but I tend to forget that, like, a majority of the time, which is not maybe the best mentality to have, he's probably bigger than the guy he's taking on, which is it favors him, I feel like, in a way. But as he gets older, I feel like that's kind of the thing that kind of took Cam down. So if you're able to maybe, because I feel like you're not going to take away his ability to run inside the red zone when it comes playoff time, 3rd downs, big games against the Chiefs, that kind of situation. You're not going to take those quarterback powers away from him and such like that. I feel like you're going to want to run him a little bit, but if you're able to take like those short yardage carries, the when he feels like he has to do so much, and you're able to just hand the ball to a running back and you're able to pick up 4 or 5 yards. I feel like that could definitely be a positive outcome. So I'm curious to see.
Just remember what Brandon Bean said at his year-end newser. He said the only thing Josh and I disagree on is the amount of hits he takes, right? So there you
Yes,
go.
and I think that's, as a fan base, they kind of agree. Like I said, 2 questions, Dave, and then I'll
Yep.
quickly get you out of here. I'll save, I guess, that one for last. I'm curious how you think the Bills should approach free agency and then the draft. They're gonna have, like I said, Tremaine Edmonds, Jordan Poyer, 2 pivotal starters. Tremaine, since he was 19 years old, has been the kind of thrust into the leader of this defense. Jordan Poyer, how much he did last year. Micah being hurt, playing with some inexperienced players, and kind of he had basically one arm. He was out there playing with knee injuries, all sort of things, especially in a free agents year where maybe teams could maybe ding him for being injured and sitting out games. He chose to play, the spleen, that kind of situation. In your opinion, what are maybe some positions they should address in free agency rather than maybe the draft, and some positions that they could address in the draft, maybe that are maybe deeper, or positions that you think that maybe they just could get better at in the draft rather than free agency?
Yeah, I think that, especially when you're drafting near the end of the first round, you're generally looking at players that, you're less certain they're going to be able to contribute for you right away. The Bills, I think, they've played a lot of rookies. I mean, they're not conservative when it comes to playing first-year players. I mean, you look at this year even. I mean, they were playing Christian Benford and Kyrie Elam, most of the season, right? So let's talk about. Okay, so first of all, if Tremaine Edmonds goes with the Bills team that they have, you're going to have to go to the market and get a veteran player to replace him. And I don't have the catalog of guys that would have skill sets that are similar to Tremaine Edmonds at my fingertips, but I don't think that's one that the Bills can draft and develop a player into that role, because you need that role filled by, at a very high level next season. Safeties may be a little different because they have some options on the roster, right? You would look at, I don't know if DeMar Hamlin is an option because of the situation. Obviously, no one knows when he's going to be back playing. There has been talk that Christian Benford, that he could be converted to safety. And he was a 6th-round pick out of Villanova last year, right?
And if I may add, both Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer, before they came to the Bills, Micah was predominantly a slot corner for Green Bay.
Sure.
Jordan did play a little bit of safety for the Browns, but he was a converted corner. So the Bills do have a little bit of history of converting defensive backs into corners.
It's a logical conversion that happens to a lot of guys, as they move up or get older and that kind of thing. So, they have some options at safety there. And could they draft a safety in the 2nd round who could be ready to play? Yeah, I think they could. I think it's probably easier to draft in that position and play because of the other players you have around that would share the role. That if a guy's not ready by the end of training camp, you would still have some players that could, fill in that role. You're going to have Micah Hyde back. Tremaine Edmonds, again, I think if he goes, that's going to have to be a shopping cart thing that you're going to have to with that. I think they probably want to improve some things on the offensive line. I think that's one of the things as well. And in terms of drafting, in terms of drafting position, I think the other question would be, are they going to try to upgrade their receivers, right, and create some more competition there? That would be, you had a player like Isaiah Hodges even who got away from them last year, right, and kind of really lit it up in with the Giants next year. And I don't know how they feel about their number 2 and their number 3. Certainly know a lot of the fans in Buffalo aren't totally enamored with number 2 and number 3. And I'm talking about Gabe Davis and Isaiah McKenzie. But I would think that, you're looking at a situation there where you're going to want to add some competition. You're going to want to add some competition along the offensive line. You're probably going to want to build some more depth at linebackers. Like when I know they took Terrell Bernard last year, but behind there's a real drop off. I think when you go off of Hyde and Edmonds last year, right? You could see that. And honestly, there's for a team that's very good, the Bills have a lot of areas in the team they could use improvement. We saw what happened with the pass rush when Von Miller wasn't there, right? Greg Rousseau maybe didn't step up as much as people would have expected. So I think players that could get to the quarterback as well for a team that does, I say, that lost 3 games in the regular season by a total of 8 points. There are areas to pick at, on the Bills. There's no question. And I think maybe some people are looking at it and saying that Josh Allen's, heroics late in games maybe made this team look a little better than it is and covered up some of the flaws.
Absolutely. I totally agree with everything you just said. I think that's kind of, as a Bills fan, what just bugs me a little bit is that narrative is like that Josh is elite as they come. Outside of Patrick Mahomes, I think Josh Allen, for in terms of what he does for a team, that's throwing the ball, that's running the ball, that's breaking tackles. I feel like the O-line is good, but there's times that he's running all over the place. He's so, I don't want to say underrated is not the right word, but just underappreciated, I feel like, is the word. Just the things that he did, and for me, I watch a little bit more than the average fan, and we have these things now where we're able to watch like film on YouTube and stuff like that. So just I feel like Josh is, especially with Bills fans, they get so like, why does he throw so many picks and all this stuff? And it's like, this guy does so much for a team that, yes, has been good on both sides of the football, but as you said, going into this year now, they're kind of going to be tested. Josh's big contract will start to kick in. I don't believe in Diggs is going to get traded, but now there's going to be some frustrations now if you don't start. If it doesn't happen next year, I couldn't imagine the noise that'll be around Diggs. So just as a franchise, I feel like we need to do more for him. And my last question, Dave, before I get you out of here, you were around the team. I'm just curious on just how you think maybe mentally I feel like mentally they were kind of exhausted by the end of the year, and just the impact. You were in the locker room, you got to talk to guys, you said, Eli Anku, you have relationships, I'm sure, in the locker room, stuff like that. Just kind of take us inside of the locker room and kind of what, more than the Damar Hamlin situation. I mean, your owner, Mrs. Pagula, Dawson Knox, the shootings in the spring, just kind of what were you seeing maybe that the outside people didn't get a glimpse of?
Well, I think it was a very noisy year, right? From the game that gets moved to Detroit to the games that, where they get the blizzard over Christmas, where guys had to be dug out. You mentioned, the trauma of the shooting. I think that Bills players probably feel their community more than a lot of people do, because they're in a smaller city like Buffalo, and 2, they're not even in Buffalo. They're in Orchard Park, New York, which is 20 minutes south, which is a small town with an NFL team rolling around in it, right? So that even makes it sort of, there's even sort of less between the players and the community. So I think they feel those things. And the Damar Hamlin thing was, I mean, unprecedented, right? And to really know what the toll that took at that time of the year, when it's already been a long football season. And the other part of it, I think, from a football perspective is, look, the Bills went to Cincinnati on that Monday night, and it looked during the first 9 minutes of that game that they were going to get beat. All right. And one of the good things about playing somebody in the regular season and get beat by them is then you can go to work fixing what didn't work and and I think the Bills really suffered from not having 60 minutes of game tape against Cincinnati from that regular season, right? Because it's like we see it in hockey, right? You go to game 1 of a series, team gets beat. Game 2, they look completely different because they went and corrected the stuff that they did wrong in game number 1, right? And that's the nature of hockey and the way series go. Football is not like that. But the fact that they had a regular season game against Cincinnati so late in the season, it was going to be a really good vehicle for them to use to go to school on Cincinnati and go to school on their own weaknesses and deficiencies. And instead, it didn't happen. And there's no second game because they played them once. They got beat. They got beat at home. They got beat handily. They were never in it. I think that's really what sort of provided, the thud of that. So, I when I look at the team, again, what were the areas of the Bills maybe at the end of the season people didn't feel great about? Secondary receivers, defensive line, secondary because of attrition. So I would say, back to your earlier question, short-term needs, maybe sort of, offensive line, additional receivers, short-term, long-term needs would be probably, depth at linebacker, depth at safety. At corner, they're pretty good actually right now, assuming Dane Jackson is going to be back. And then, we talked about the addition of a possible dynamic running back. But yeah, that's one of the things I think that this it felt like and I was in the Bills right from training camp all the way through. So by the time you got to the end of the year, it felt like you were looking back on a road that just had a lot of noise on it. And these guys are human, and I know that fans don't want to hear that kind of stuff, but when you get paid all that kind of money and you got one job to do once a week, on Sundays. But I think the reality was the Bills were both fatigued mentally, and I think they really were hurt by not having that game against Cincinnati during the regular season at the end of the year. At a time where they weren't necessarily playing their best football either.
Yeah, I agree. I think just the frustrating part for me is kind of Brandon Beane's built such a foundation of this team. We've had some success now. We're kind of to that point where we're gonna start losing guys and there'll be holes to fill, but Josh being the player that he is will kind of cover up, I feel like, a lot of those holes. Joe Burrow said something about his window being open the entire career. I feel like Josh Allen's that same type of player where the window will always be open, but maybe it's just where when you get into January and February and your team just from all those holes and just the dam bursts and you're not able to cover up those things for a full season and then the playoffs and overcome those things. So I'm super curious. A lot of holes to fill. You've invested, unfortunately, a lot of picks into the D line. You've invested that big contract into Von Miller. Greg Rousseau was a first round pick. Ed Oliver, a couple of second round picks in Boogie and AJ. And I think you kind of need to turn over that position a little bit, and you're not getting the production from those the second round picks in Boogie and AJ. AJ was pretty much your first round pick because you gave up the first round picks in the Diggs trade. So AJ was your first team pick that year, and kind of has underwhelmed. I feel like you got guys like Shaq Lawson, these veterans that are coming in and competing for snaps, when I feel like if you've invested that high, you should be reaping some of those benefits, and even the running back position. So there's a lot of holes, and I'm curious to see how the Bills kind of attack this offseason, because it's going to be a big and important one, especially in the AFC that could be getting Aaron Rodgers that's in the division, and it's just already stacked with quarterbacks and talent around those quarterbacks. So I'm curious to see how that turns out.
Well, remember, one thing every football team says, they want to be playing their best football at the end of the season. The Bills were playing their best football in September last year.
Yeah. So Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. You gave us a little bit over 45 minutes, so I apologize for keeping you for so long,
All
but
right.
you blend the perfect kind of what I want to do with this podcast. I want to cover Coast to Coast Gridiron is the name. I want to cover from my coast to your coast of Canadian football, Canadian talent. I feel like there's not enough of coverage of the Canadian athletes and kind of what they're doing in the sport of football. And then just the coverage of the CFL in itself. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more of storytelling for these athletes, for these teams. And then obviously the NFL is king. Personally, I'm one of the biggest Bills fans in the world. So I feel like the NFL has enough of its talk, so I will be talking about a few key details here and there, but personally, I'll be focusing on the Bills. So like I said, from my coast all the way to New York, I'll be following the Bills all year long. So you do a good job of kind of giving my viewers a nice blend of all of it in one. So this was a really fun podcast for me to record.
Well, thanks so much, Cole, for having me. Have good luck with this, and I'll talk to you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate you joining me, and I hope to talk to you again. Thank you for joining me, like I said. So we'll get out of here, Dave.
Peace.
And what's up, guys, and welcome back to Coast Gridiron Football Podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed the Dave Naylor interview. It was really fun to record. It covered kind of all the bases that I want to talk about on this channel. CFL news, Dave's insights from being at the NFL Combine, and then, of course, I snuck in a few Bills questions at the end. So really good time with Dave. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely hope to have Dave back on the podcast. Like I said, he kind of covers all the bases of what I want this podcast to be, and that's kind of cover the Canadian Football League as a whole, its athletes, any news kind of surrounding the CFL, and then obviously NFL is king. It has a lot of content already, so I would kind of want to stay away from the NFL specific talk, but anytime there's some news or something like a combine, Super Bowl week, that kind of stuff, big news in the NFL, we definitely going to talk about on this channel. And then obviously, like I said, I snuck in a few Bills questions because I will be doing a lot of Bills talk just because that's my team and that's who I like to talk about, especially during the season. So hope you guys enjoyed the Dave Naylor interview. It was a lot of fun and can't thank Dave enough. I know how busy he is and it was awesome getting to talk to him for about an hour. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Moving forward, NFL free agency, the legal tampering period will start Monday, March 13th. Free agency opening Wednesday, March 15th. So I believe you'll probably be hearing about some word of people agreeing to contracts on Monday, kind of when that tampering period opens up, just like the CFL, and you're going to be hearing a lot of agreed to contracts, agreed to terms, those kind of things, and then Wednesday they'll become official. So I plan on probably being back unless the Bills make a huge splash or something like that, which I don't see happening this year, unfortunately. So I'll probably be back next weekend with a guest, hopefully a Bills related guest. Maybe I have a few guys on the top of my head that I might reach out to and see if they're able to come on and give us a little bit of time. But until then, nothing official. It's going to be probably a little bit of a slow time for the CFL until the season kind of kicks around. The draft will be in May there, and then the preseason training camp kind of kicks off middle of May, end of May there, and then is it June yet? Obviously, when the season will be here. So I'll try my best to find creative ways to still talk about the CFL, maybe have some guests on, that kind of thing. But I think it's going to be a little bit of a quieter time in terms of CFL news. Like I said, though, I'll try my best to find creative ways to still have guests on or do some sort of creative CFL talk. I definitely have some plans to have a good buddy of mine, Noah, on the podcast and have some good CFL NFL talk. Unfortunately, he's a Dolphin fan. Just kidding, Noah. But yeah, so I definitely have some plans for some guests here during this slow time. Free agency opens up, like I said, next week. But after that, it'll be kind of after that first initial wave of free agents kind of sign, it'll start to become quieter again and it'll turn towards getting ready for the NFL draft. So, like I said, hope you guys enjoyed the Dave Naylor interview. I'll be back probably next weekend unless there's some big news during the week. The Bills really in a big ticket free agent or something like that. So, hope you guys enjoyed. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe on the YouTube. Follow, download the episodes on the Apple Podcasts, leave a review. Everything helps. So I appreciate everyone's support and hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Coast to Coast Gridiron, a football podcast, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.